Hey, everybody, we're about 1 minute to, and we'll get started in about a little over a minute now. Okay, well, my clock is showing the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. And welcome to everyone. My name is Scott Burlingame. I'm an April board member and the facilitator of the call today. Thank you for joining us for this workshop, which is COVID realities and implications for persons with disabilities. I want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started today. First, when you scroll over the screen on a menu bar pops up. Depending on what device you are on, you can find the menu bar on the top or of the screen. That is where you will find the closed captioning bar for today's session. You can view the captioning bar by selecting the CC tab on the menu bar. For sign language interpreting, you will find the interpreter on the screen. If you would like to change the size of your screen, if the slides are shown, you can select the line in the middle to make the slides larger or smaller. If you have technical issues, please use the chat feature. You can find the word bubble on the same menu bar. If you would like to turn the chat feature off, you are using a screen reader, you can do so by pressing Alt-H. For Q&A times, please note the Q&A box is in the menu bar. Please submit only one question, or please only submit questions there, as they may get lost in the chat. To answer questions or make a comment, you can also select the hand option on the menu bar, and that allows us to know that you have a question. For those of you on the phone today or using keystrokes, we ask that you press #9 or Alt-Y on your keypad to raise your hand. We will then let you know when you can unmute. You can select the unmute option or Alt+A using keystrokes. Remember, if you join the conversation, please keep all background noise mute down as much as possible to allow us to hear you clearly. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to today's first presenter, Robin Jones.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I hope everyone is having a great Monday and is ready to learn a little bit more information about COVID and the realities for individuals with disabilities. This session is being brought to you today as part of our sponsorship of the ADA National Network with the April conference, and we welcome the opportunity to be working with you today. I'm just going to take a moment before I turn it over to our main speakers to make sure everyone is familiar and aware of the ADA National Network. The ADA National Network is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, Rehabilitation, and Research, which is part of ACL. It is made up of 10 regional centers that are dispersed across the country. And our core mission is to provide guidance, training, and technical assistance and materials on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are not a legal entity and do not provide legal advice. We have a national 800 number, which can be reached across the country. The same number will connect you with the center in the geographic area you are located in, which is 800-949-4232. We also have a website which has a wealth of information. We have an exhibit in the April conference. If you want to go and visit it, it shares a lot of our resources and things with you on that exhibit page as well. But our website is www.adata.org. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and move forward and introduce our presenters and move forward with the topic today. We look forward to having your questions as well. At this time, I'm going to turn over the microphone to one of our presenters, who is Anne Deschamps, who is the director of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and she will also be joined by her cohort, Nancy Horton, who is the associate director of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. Anne and Nancy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Robin. We are really happy to be here. As Robin said, I'm Ann Deschamps. I'm the director of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. My pronouns are she and her. I have shoulder-length brown hair and middle-aged and wear glasses. Nancy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ann. My name's Nancy Horton. I also work at the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center with Ann. I am an older woman with what I like to call salt and pepper hair pulled back in my pandemic ponytail.
So just a word about our format today. Nancy and I are going to have a conversation. So in addition to the slides, we are going to be going back and forth talking about these COVID issues to hopefully to make it interesting. We absolutely will take questions, and you can put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end of the presentation for questions. So Nancy, let's dive right in here and get down to one of the biggest questions that we have seen since the pandemic started is, does COVID-19 or long COVID meet the definition of disability under the ADA? And just as a reminder for all of you in the audience, because I think we have a broad audience with different levels of knowledge of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The definition of disability under the ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Having a record of such an impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. And so it is purposely a threshold that you meet, a formula for determining whether you have a disability under the ADA. So how does COVID and long COVID figure into this, Nancy?
Well, this is a really great question that people have, and it's something that has evolved over time. As many of you may know, in the early days of the pandemic, we didn't really have what we're now calling long COVID. And the question was, does COVID-19 meet the definition of disability? And in many cases, it did not. Many people get COVID-19 and they recover in a couple of weeks and they have no residual effects. And as time went on, we were finding that a lot of people that were surviving COVID were having some very serious and very long-term after effects. And as some of you may know, the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services have recently put out a technical assistance document where they talk about long COVID specifically as a disability and make it very clear that their position in terms of the ADA and other laws like the Affordable Care Act certainly can meet the definition of disability, that people are having these really serious long-term effects. But as it always has been under the ADA, determining if someone meets this definition really does require an individualized assessment.
Yes, it does. And I think that's going to be one of our themes today, individualized assessment. Slide 4, please, Robin. So having addressed the issue of disability, let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about employment. Slide 5, please. Under the employment provisions of the ADA, we know that employers are required to make reasonable accommodation to qualified employees and applicants with disabilities. So Nancy, talk a little bit about how COVID and long COVID figures into the reasonable accommodation process.
Well, this is sort of one of the heart pieces of the ADA, is this reasonable accommodation piece in employment. And very recently, after the guidance document I just mentioned, it came out from the Department of Justice and Department of Health and Human Services about long COVID, the EEOC the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, posted just a notice on their website saying that they agree with the reasoning that the DOJ and HHS had put forth in that document, that long COVID certainly can meet the definition of disability. Now, they're not really saying that COVID by itself, which is really kind of a separate thing from what we're calling long COVID. COVID doesn't, anybody who has COVID isn't necessarily going to meet the definition of disability, but people with long COVID are certainly more likely to meet that definition. So we have these sort of two categories of people that we tend to see when we start talking about reasonable accommodation in employment. And one is individuals who have or have had COVID or have long COVID and they're currently dealing with that. When that meets that definition, they need accommodations for themselves to, in many cases, deal with getting treatment or dealing with the effects of their conditions. They need accommodations in the workplace. They might need time off to go to appointments, things of that nature. And the other category that we sometimes see, and we've seen this since the early days of the pandemic, is individuals who have disabilities that make them more vulnerable to contracting COVID or experiencing really severe effects of COVID. And they are often asking for accommodations that are more geared toward reducing their exposure to COVID. And so they are sometimes asking for accommodations like things in the workplace to help protect themselves from exposure more, working from home to reduce exposure and things of that nature. So we're definitely seeing both of these sorts of issues in the workplace. And we did just want to kind of take this opportunity to remind folks that under the ADA, that three-part definition of disability that Anne spoke about in the beginning, the ADA protects people who are regarded as having disabilities, and that's designed to protect people who are discriminated against based on an assumption or a rumor or something of that nature that they have a disability when in fact they really don't. They might have an impairment, they might have a minor impairment, they might have nothing, but they're discriminated against based on this perception. And another category of folks that we want to talk about just a little bit is what we sometimes call associates, people who are associated with people with disabilities. They have some relationship with a person or a group of people with disabilities, and they're sometimes discriminated against in employment as well for a variety of reasons. And so these folks in these categories are protected from discrimination. They're entitled to equal treatment in the workplace, but they are not entitled to reasonable accommodation. So that's important to remember, because another thing that we've had a lot of questions about in our center, and I think across the country during the pandemic, are people who have a family member or maybe someone in their household or something who has a disability that makes them vulnerable to COVID, and folks are asking for accommodations like working from home or things to reduce the chance of bringing that exposure to that person at home. And that is not something that the ADA actually requires employers to do, although many employers have been pretty generous with policies during the pandemic. But we just wanted to sort of make sure that folks understood that distinction.
Yes, and I think that's a very important distinction, because COVID is affecting everyone. It's touching everyone, people with disabilities and people without disabilities too. So what we're doing here, if you can see, is essentially we're taking the requirements of the ADA, which have been the requirements since the law was passed and certainly clarified with the 2008 Amendments Act. And we're just applying the issues and talking about the issues that we've seen recently with the pandemic. The law has not changed at all. The EEOC and Department of Justice are trying to provide guidance but as with everything with the pandemic, I think we're all learning together as we go. So we're really, you'll see the theme as we go through this presentation, the essential components and concepts of the ADA, like reasonable accommodation, and we're just plugging in the certain situations with somebody with COVID or long COVID, or somebody who has a relative with COVID or long COVID. Slide number 6, please. So looking at the limitations of reasonable accommodation, so employers have an obligation to provide applicants or employees with disabilities reasonable accommodation unless it would be an undue hardship, which is defined as significant difficulty or expense, which is a pretty high standard, or unless providing the accommodation would pose a direct threat, which, just a reminder, significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of oneself or others, which cannot be eliminated or reduced with a reasonable accommodation. And again, you see that here again, based on individualized assessment. So Nancy, talk a little bit about how direct threat plays into COVID and COVID-19 and long COVID.
Well, this is an area where it certainly has presented some challenges with the pandemic. Direct threat, has always been there in the ADA, and it can be a challenge for workers and employers. Again, it really needs to be a significant risk of substantial harm based on an individualized assessment. We don't want to see speculation here and assumptions and those kinds of things. But the EEOC in particular and other federal agencies, almost from the early days of the pandemic, really have been in agreement that the risk of spreading COVID can certainly rise to the level of direct threat. It's a serious disease. It's highly contagious. It's a dangerous disease. And so this certainly can come into play when individuals are asking for reasonable accommodations that might mean they would be creating a threat of spreading COVID in a workplace.
So a question here. So can an employer potentially consider a person with a disability who does not have the vaccine because of their disability a direct threat in the workplace?
They certainly might. It's, again, depending on the nature of the workplace and the job. And, again, when we look at direct threat, we always want to remember that before we say, well, this person is a direct threat, we have to put it in the context of the specific person and the job and the workplace. And we need to make sure that we've considered any reasonable accommodation that might mitigate that threat. And so in some situations, somebody who's, for example, unvaccinated, that might be able to provide some other reasonable accommodations that would reduce that threat or eliminate it entirely. Maybe some additional protective measures in the workplace. Or again, one of our ever popular, especially in recent times, accommodations of working from home. Not all jobs, of course, can be done from home, but sometimes there are accommodations in the workplace that can help address the threat.
And I think that's a really important point, Nancy. So an employer can't say, you're a direct threat, that's it, end of discussion. They have to consider if there is an accommodation that can be implemented to reduce the, to enable the person to do their job.
Yes, absolutely. It's that sort of interactive process, and it's that process that we often need to have when accommodations are requested to really figure out what can we do in this situation.
Right, right. Individualized assessment. Okay, slide number
Absolutely.
7, please. So we were talking around it, now we'll talk at it, but specifically slide 7 talks about workplace policies. Requirements such as using, because a lot of employers now have new workplace policies given the pandemic. So they might have requirements such as use of face masks or other personal protective equipment, social distancing and separation protocols, cleaning procedures, hand sanitizing, vaccination requirements, which we're starting to see. And so what you're telling us, Nancy, is that these may be considered valid requirements, and they are subject to the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation to workers with disabilities. Is that?
Exactly. That's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, this is one of the most common questions that we've had in our center through the pandemic, and especially more lately, as vaccination has become available. As you said, many employers are now requiring their workers to be vaccinated. And the EEOC has said for some time that these are generally going to be very valid workplace requirements. But just like any other workplace policy, it is going to be subject to the obligation to consider reasonable accommodation for workers with disabilities. So if a worker, because of the disability that they have, is not able to be vaccinated, then the employer is again going to have to consider that worker, how can we accommodate that worker so that they can continue their work, continue in their job? Is that possible without being vaccinated? So again, let's look at other workplace protections that we could use, all of that sort of thing. So again, we have to sort of go through that process. But even the EEOC has said this is generally, it's a qualification standard. It's a legitimate requirement.
Okay, slide number 8, please. Now we're going to transition out of the employment world and transition right into public programs and private businesses, and talk a little bit about how the ADA concepts and COVID-19 and long COVID interrelate to public programs, state and local governments, and private businesses. Slide number 9, please. So as we've said, the core obligations of the ADA, nothing has changed at all. We're just taking these core obligations and concepts and applying what we're seeing with COVID-19 and the pandemic. So covered entities, again, must ensure access to programs, so goods, services, and activities. That includes non-discrimination in the provision of services for which individuals are eligible, such as medical care, vaccinations, testing, etc. Covered entities must make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, and procedures when necessary to allow a person with a disability to take advantage of the program or service. And then our good old effective communication. There's the obligation to communicate effectively with individuals who have a hearing, vision, or speech disability. So again, the core obligations are right here, and just a nice basic review again. So what does all this mean when it comes to COVID, Nancy?
Well, one thing that I think I would stress here is that this sort of overarching obligation to ensure access to programs and services and so forth when it comes to COVID. And we saw a lot of debate around some of these issues in the early days of the pandemic, when we started seeing policies and talk about rationing and so forth of medical care, of scarce medical equipment and so forth. And so I just, we want to remind folks that, to sort of make decisions about the allocation of care or resources needs to be not just based on disability, that people with disabilities are just not going to be automatically excluded or sent to the back of the line, so to speak, for these sorts of opportunities.
Right, that the ADA still exists in the pandemic world. And so that's kind of the main highlight of that. Okay, moving on to slide number 10. Now, clearly, just as in the employment provisions, there are limitations to the obligations to provide program access, ensure effective communication, and modify policies, practices, and procedures. On slide 10, we have the limitation on obligations. Covered entities are not required to take any action that would cause a fundamental alteration or an undue burden. And fundamental alteration means changing the essential nature of goods, services, and activities. And an undue burden means significant difficulty or expense, much like undue hardship. And when fundamental alterations or undue burdens arise, entities must consider alternatives. Can you give us some examples of a situation where this might come into play, Nancy?
Sure. I mean, I think that there could be a number of examples, but one example that we got a lot of questions about in our center were people who wanted to go into public places without masks, before there were vaccinations or any of that, or people who, because of their disabilities, wearing masks was difficult for them. And so they wanted to be just allowed to go places where masks were required. And we've known from the early days of the pandemic, federal agencies and all the medical folks in the CDC are telling us that, having a policy that requires masks is a valid policy. And so people were asking to either be excused from wearing a mask and still allowed to come in, or they were saying, I want you to clear the place out and let me come in by myself. And in some cases, asking the grocery store or a shop or something, it's not a place you go by appointment, to just close the place down or something so somebody can come in by themselves is not going to be a reasonable thing for them to do. That's really just changing kind of the fundamental way they operate. They have hours and you don't need an appointment and so forth. But one of the important points that we want to make about that is that they still need to consider if there are other ways, if there are alternatives where the service or the goods can be provided. And we've seen a lot of businesses and organizations and government agencies being very creative about this and doing things like really ramping up their curbside. You order online or you call on the phone, we'll bring it out, we'll put it in your car and do all these kinds of things. So that's sort of we want to really underscore that. It's again, when we kind of feel like we've hit the dead end, let's make sure we really have explored all the alternatives. And that's what we see on on this slide, this common question, which is very similar to some of the questions that we see in employment, but in other settings, in state and local government programs, in private businesses, where there are requirements like you have to wear a face mask, or you have to follow certain protocols about social distancing and one-way circulation routes and all these things. Or even in some settings, like for example, schools, you have to be vaccinated to be there, to go there. And again, what we're seeing is that these are generally the federal agencies and even a few courts at this point. We haven't seen a lot of legal activity. Obviously, we don't tend to see things bubbling up through the courts real quickly. But we have seen a few courts already saying, these kinds of requirements are valid requirements. There are good reasons behind them, and therefore the requirements can stand. It's just, again, are there reasonable modifications that we can provide so that people can get the goods and services, or are there auxiliary aids and services that we can employ so that we can communicate effectively with people in that situation. Sometimes we've seen a lot of questions around mask policies related to communication. Masks can make it really difficult, for example, for someone who's hard of hearing to communicate with other people. Their voices are muffled, their faces are mostly hidden by the mask, and so that's going to make it hard for them to communicate. So there might be some auxiliary aids or services that could be used, anything from using whiteboards or text messaging or something for simple exchanges, all the way to more sophisticated methods like using assistive listening devices or remote captioning services for more complex interactions. So again, we just want to underscore to really explore the possibilities.
Right, and it seems as though the COVID just adds an additional layer here. So it's something to consider. And so as long as the conversation continues to look at alternatives, I think that is an important point to make. There's, you don't want to just say no and be done with it. It's like, have you considered how you can modify a policy, or how it can be done? And sometimes you need to get creative in order for that to happen. Okay, moving on to slide number 11. I think we were on 10 and now we want to go to 11, which is health and safety.
I think we want to, oh, here we go.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Okay. Well, and we've touched on this. So do we want to, because we've kind of gotten ahead here, you said covered entities may establish legitimate and necessary safety requirements based on actual risk. And again, underscoring the actual risk, it has to be based on actual data. And covered entities do not have to allow an individual with a disability to propose a direct threat to the health and safety or others. And again, we have the individualized assessment. I'm not sure, did you want to say anything further here?
I don't think so. I think
Okay.
that we just kind of got ahead of ourselves. But again, this is a very similar concept to what we see in employment.
Great. Yeah, it is. It is. It's the same, just different words here. Okay, slide number 12, please.
And I think that's the one that we sort of jumped ahead and we really talked about that.
Maybe right. We were jumping ahead. That's great. Okay. Okay. Now we will go to slide number 13. Thank you. Where we talk about testing and vaccines and treatment. And so now we're really going to zero in and get down to brass tacks here. Slide 14, please. And talk a little bit about specifics related to sites and facilities, specific related to state and local government, and then look at the private businesses. So again, state and local governments have the obligation to ensure program access. And so not all testing, vaccination, or treatment sites need to be accessible, but if not all are accessible, a reasonable number of comparable sites must be accessible, and information about which sites are accessible should be readily available to the public. Nancy, do you want to talk about this a little bit more?
Well, I think that I would just say that, one of the common problems that we've seen, and this is really not only with the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has made everything more challenging, right, for all of us, is this last point about getting information to the public. We've really responded to a lot of calls and questions about people, from people with disabilities, particularly having a lot of trouble finding information about pandemic-related programs and services. Where do I go to get a vaccine? Is it accessible? Are they going to be able to accommodate me, at this site? Do I have to go someplace farther from home? All these kinds of things. It's been a real challenge for some people to get information. And so we really want to stress that point. If you're kind of putting all information out on a website, then the information about accessibility and all of that needs to be there too. And if there's a phone number for people to call, then the people who answer that phone line should, have this kind of information so that they can get this information to people who need it.
Yeah, it's important to remember whenever putting out any new information at all, whether it's about COVID or not. So, okay, let's move on to slide 15, please. Okay, let's look at private businesses now, businesses that serve the public. They have, just as they do under the ADA, existing buildings are subject to requirements to remove barriers when it's readily achievable. And so as a result, all existing buildings may not be accessible. Can you talk a little bit more about this, Nancy?
Well, this is just a place where we do see a little bit of distinction, as kind of a real distinction between the requirements that apply to state and local governments and the requirements that apply to private businesses like drugstores, for example. Like we have this image on this slide of this People's Drugstore. This is, I think, 1920s, and this drugstore could be still standing there and operating. A lot of older buildings are, still in operation. And so, when it's private businesses, they have this obligation to remove barriers, but it's not always going to be readily achievable. It's not always going to be doable at all. So as I'm sure most folks know, there's a lot of variety out there in the world. There's a lot of places that are not accessible, and maybe they aren't going to be. So again, getting information is going to be really important for people to, to be able to get that information. As we know, a lot of private businesses, including drugstores, it's a great example. They're giving vaccinations, right? So, which drugstore in my community is accessible is something that people need to be able to find out.
Right, without having to dig too much, hopefully. Okay, slide 16, please. One of my favorite topics, temporary facilities. Talk a little bit, this definitely has been an issue in COVID. So
Sure
services provided in temporary or mobile facilities are absolutely covered by the ADA. So talk a little bit about what we've seen at the center and the calls and the questions from these.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is not an issue that's limited to, COVID. It's always been in the ADA, and the ADA standards even specifically cover temporary facilities. But of course, with COVID, we have seen a lot of that. We've seen testing facilities in parking lots and vaccination sites in temporary places like this image on this slide that looks like, I mean, it's a building. It's not a tent, but we've seen that too. But it looks like maybe it typically serves as a warehouse or something of that nature. And they've taken some tape and some cones, and they've taped off lanes on the floor, and they've done all this sort of stuff to create a vaccination site. And the ADA is going to reach this. If this is being done by a state or local government or a private business that's offering these services to the general public, then this is going to be reached by the ADA. Mobile facilities as well, like your bloodmobile and your bookmobile and all of that. This is just another example. If there's a vaccination mobile going around your community, how are people with disabilities going to be able to access that service? So this can present a challenge. Some places have done a really good job of making sure that temporary facilities are accessible, but sometimes there can be oversights.
Yeah, especially when they're doing it in a hurry and they're rushing and they want to get it set up and start serving people quickly. They sometimes forget about fundamental issues. So and we know we've seen that before. Slide number 17, please. So going back to effective communication, which we talked about a little bit early, and auxiliary aids and services may be needed to ensure effective communication with individuals who have vision, hearing, or speech disabilities. And again, this is going to be an individualized assessment based on the case and what the nature of the communication. And telephone systems used to get information and make appointments must be effective for individuals using a telecommunications relay service. Tell me a little bit more about the effective communication requirements applied to COVID.
Well, I think, and we did touch a bit on auxiliary aids and services a little bit earlier. It's, again, put it in a context, individualize it to the nature of the individual's needs and the situation and the type of communication that's going on. We have simple exchanges, we have complex, medical exchanges, we have all these kinds of things, and we just need to really put that in context. And we kind of really wanted to include this item about telephone systems being effective for people who use relay services, people who are deaf and hard of hearing. We have speech disabilities and use relay services, because this is very often it's a matter of training for the people who are operating these telephone systems, so that they have the awareness about what is a relay call, what is that when you get an operator, a communications assistant, an interpreter on the phone saying, I'm got this relay call from this person, and so that the folks who are answering those calls really understand what that is and don't hang up and don't say, I can't take a call, or, can't take that, and all of those sorts of responses. So it's another example of how important it is in any ADA program to really give some basic training to that frontline staff that are going to be interacting directly with the public.
Absolutely. I think we see this a lot. Customer service training is so important. because it's frequently the frontline personnel that are the point where communication breaks down, and that might cause problems.
Exactly.
and provide barriers for people with disabilities. Okay, slide number 18, please. It wouldn't be an ADA presentation unless we talked about digital access, especially in today's day and age. So again, applying the concepts which Nancy has been talking about, access to websites and mobile apps to find information, make appointments, etc. We have to ensure effective communication, and got to look at compatibility with assistive technology used by people with disabilities that affect mobility or dexterity. And can you talk a little bit about digital access issues?
Well, like you said, it is just, I mean, in this day and age, it seems like we have to go on a website or an app to do anything, right?
Right.
And while this is great in many ways, it opens up a lot of opportunities, you know, makes things, for some of us, in some cases, more accessible, more available, more convenient. But if these things aren't really built to be accessible and be compatible with assistive technologies, it can just create another type of barrier for people with disabilities trying to get information, make those appointments,
Right.
figure things out. So these are just a couple of quick examples, just a couple of highlights. You know, just kind of want to make sure that this is on people's radar, and you know, as advocates of going out in the community, working with, say, state and local government programs, which are really ultimately responsible for implementation of a lot of the things we're talking about, especially when it comes to healthcare and all of these sorts of things, that these apps and websites, some of which are being kind of thrown up, you know, again, very quickly, just like the temporary physical sites. And we want to see them to be accessible. We don't want a lot of dancing bears and flashing lights and things jumping around. We want simple designs, plain language, compatibility with assistive technology, so that people with disabilities can try to get that same level of convenient access where they do have access to those things.
Right, and as with everything with universal design, I mean, it makes so much sense, and it makes it easier for a lot of people without disabilities as well. So it's in everybody's best interest. Okay, we're getting to our last two slides here before we transition to some Q&A, and I'm not sure, I haven't been looking, but I know Robin's gonna see if we have any questions here. So if we can go to slide 19, please, and look at reasonable modifications again, just as we looked at effective communication. So here are some more examples of common modifications to policies, practices, and procedures that businesses and state and local governments may be doing to accommodate individuals with disabilities. And, you know, service animals is always an issue too, but certainly adjusting communication methods to accommodate individuals with intellectual development and cognitive disabilities. This is separate from the sensory disabilities, which we just talked about. Modifying a limited visitation policy in a medical facility to enable an individual with a disability to have a needed support person or service provider present, really important in the hospitals. Admitting service animals and providing seating to accommodate individuals who have difficulty standing for long periods of time, maybe standing in line at a temporary facility for a vaccine or for a test. Anything you'd like to add to this one, Nancy?
Not much really. I mean, again, these were just some of the common things that we've seen or had a lot of questions about, and you know, just wanted to remind folks that, again, be creative and try to accommodate folks, these are just a few examples. There could be all kinds of other things that folks might ask for. So we just encourage folks, before you say, no, we've never heard of such a thing, or we've never done anything like that, just take a little breath there and think about it a minute, and think about, do you need to maybe get your supervisor, or think about it a minute.
Right. And I was thinking too, if you're going to advocate, then come with some suggestions and ideas, and use our wonderful friends at the Job Accommodation Network, Jan, at askjan.org, askjan.org, if you're looking for accommodation options too, or certainly call your local ADA center as well, and we can brainstorm some possibilities too of problem solving. So let's transition to slide number 20, please. So Nancy, how would we recommend that Centers for Independent Living, help in their community?
Well, these were just a couple of ideas that we thought might be helpful to, as folks leave our session here today, to think about, how can we all go back to our communities and maybe try to, make a positive difference with all the terrible things that are been going on in the world for the last year and a half, around some of these issues that have proven to be challenging for people with disabilities during this pandemic. And so we've talked a lot about how difficult it's been for people with disabilities sometimes to get information, just to get the information, let alone to get the test or the vaccine or the treatment, just to get the information about it. And so really encourage, we really encourage organizations, businesses, use multiple methods, use different languages to put information out there. Don't just put everything all on the website and nowhere else. Think about, different ways of getting information out to the public service announcements, posting signs, old-fashioned ways, be creative. Think about collaborations, how are people going to be able to get to testing sites and vaccine sites and treatment sites and so forth? Can we work together? Are there collaborations that we can rev up? Are there volunteer programs that we can plug in? And again, trying to encourage sites to really think about accommodating individuals in many cases as part of the planning process, and not necessarily just waiting for somebody to make that request or ask that question. How can we make our site or our program accommodating by design? Maybe we don't want to take out all of our chairs because we don't want everybody sitting so close, but maybe we want to leave a few for folks who have difficulty with the standing in line. Or what about people who maybe can't wear a face mask? Are we going to be able to do something with a different location or a different schedule or an appointment or something? So we just want folks to really remember that kind of our core principle of be creative, let's be problem solvers about this, and we can probably make a real positive difference with some of these issues.
And it's such a good time to educate people, because again, this is a rare opportunity. Nobody has been through a pandemic before, and so everybody is learning. And so it's a great opportunity to educate everybody about getting creative and ensuring that everybody is participating and has access to services and getting what they need to work and to be effective. Okay, slide 21, please. We have come to the time of our presentation. I'm not sure if there are any questions out there, but I just want to pause for a minute to see if anybody has any questions that they would like us to address.
Yes, thank you, both Anne and Nancy, for the information that you've been able to provide to us today. We do have a couple of questions that we can start and deal with in the time that we have remaining for the session. One question is, what to do if the employee of a workplace can't get vaccinated due to some type of an underlying condition? What kind of accommodations can be given to that person if the employer has a mandatory vaccination requirement?
Great question, and it's a pretty common one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, again, it obviously it really depends on the nature of the job and the workplace. You know, one of the most common requests for accommodation that we've been talking to people about in the last year and a half is working from home.
Yeah.
You know, but of course, and that could be a possibility for a lot of people in a lot of jobs, but